If you love powerful Wild West stories, hit like and subscribe, no matter where you're watching from or where you're from in the world. When a quiet cowboy saves a frozen Apache woman from the edge of death, he unknowingly sparks a chain of events that will change both their destinies forever. Let's get started. Winter wind howled across the plains like a living spirit, its cry rolling through the empty dark. Snow sliced sideways, sharp as broken glass. Jonah Briggs tightened the scarf around his neck and stepped out of the barn, lantern swinging at his side, trying to keep the cold from biting through his bones. Frost crackled under his boots as he crossed the yard. Nights like this were dangerous, cold enough to freeze a strong man in minutes. Jonah meant only to latch the barn door, but something caught his eye. Footprints, small, unsteady, not shaped like a man's. They wavered, staggered, as if made by someone near collapse. He lifted the lantern higher. The wind kicked up, half burying the prints under drifting snow. Jonah's jaw tightened. No traveler should be out on a night like this. Curiosity tugged at him, but something deeper, instinct, maybe mercy, pushed him forward. He followed the faint trail, boots crunching slow and steady. Only a few yards later, his lantern's glow caught a shape in the snow. A fallen figure curled against the cold, body shaking in quick, weak tremors. Jonah hurried forward. His breath caught when he saw her clearly, an Apache woman, young and exhausted, wrapped in torn deerskin stiff with frost. Snow clung to her black hair, frozen in strands along her cheek. Her lips were blue, nearly unmoving. She tried to lift her head but collapsed again. Jonah knelt beside her, touching her shoulder gently. Her skin was ice-cold, like touching stone. She flinched, but too weak to fight or flee. "Easy now," Jonah murmured, voice low. "I ain't here to harm you." Her dark eyes flickered open, dazed, fearful, but still full of life that refused to surrender. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked into a breathless gasp. Jonah didn't wait another second. He slipped his heavy coat from his shoulders and wrapped it around her trembling frame. She was far lighter than he expected, thin from hunger, weakened by the cold. He lifted her carefully, feeling how limp she'd become, barely clinging to consciousness. The wind screamed louder as he carried her. Snow pounded against his face, turning the world white. Jonah lowered his head and pushed through the storm, step by step. The woman's weak breath ghosted against his collar, growing fainter with every moment. He whispered encouragement, thought he didn't know if she could hear a word. By the time he reached his cabin door, his arms burned from strain. He kicked the door open and stepped inside, warmth hitting him like a wall. The fire in the hearth had burned low, but still glowed. Jonah moved quickly, laying her gently on his bed, closest to the flame's heat. He removed the frozen deerskin clothing piece by piece, careful not to tear the stiff fabric. Her hands were swollen and pale, fingers stiff from frost. She winced when he touched them, but her voice still wouldn't come. Jonah grabbed a blanket, thick and woolen, and draped it around her shoulders. Her breathing was shallow, too shallow. He knelt beside her and rubbed her arms to coax warmth back into them. The fire crackled, shadows dancing across her face. She looked barely alive, but her eyes, though half closed, still fought to stay open. Jonah felt fear rise in his chest. "Don't you give up," he whispered, leaning close. "Not tonight." He filled a tin cup with warm water and held it to her lips. She tried to drink but could barely swallow. He waited, patient, letting the heat do its work. Her trembling eased, but only slightly. The cold had sunk deep, deeper than simple blankets could cure. For a long while, Jonah simply stayed beside her. The storm outside battered the walls, wind moaning through the cracks. Inside, the fire glowed steadily, warming the small room. He could hear the faint rattle of her breaths, steady but fragile, like a flame fighting to stay lit. Her eyes fluttered open again, and this time they lingered on his face. Confusion filled them, fear too, and exhaustion that cut deeper than the cold. She tried to lift her hand, but it dropped back to the bed. Jonah caught it before it fell, holding it gently between his palms. "You're safe here," he said softly. "Rest. That's all you need to do." Her lips parted, forming faint shapes, no sound coming out. He shook his head lightly. "Don't force it, you're near frozen through. Save your strength." She blinked once, slow, as if grateful for the permission to stop trying. Jonah fetched a pot from the stove and set more water to warm. He added herbs, ones he used for shock and cold sickness, letting the steam fill the cabin. The smell drifted toward the bed, and the woman's breathing eased just a little, though her body still shivered beneath the blanket. He returned to her side and pressed his hand lightly against her forehead. Cold, not fever, but dangerous cold. He added more wood to the fire, flames rising with a low roar. Light washed across her skin, revealing signs of exhaustion. Dark circles, cracked lips, small cuts from traveling rough ground. Minutes passed, then an hour. Jonah didn't leave her side. At times, her breathing steadied. At times, it faded into shallow quivers that made his stomach twist with worry. He could only imagine what she had run from, what had driven her into such a storm alone. But those questions didn't matter now. Only survival mattered. Finally, her breaths grew deeper, still weak but steady. Jonah let out a long, slow breath of his own. Relief washed over him. He had feared she might slip away silently, snow still clinging to her hair. But she was holding on, fighting with whatever strength she had left. Outside, the storm raged harder. It beat against the roof, shaking the cabin. Jonah sat back in the chair beside the bed, exhaustion creeping into his own bones. He brushed snow from his sleeves and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. Her eyes opened again for a brief moment, and she whispered something, too soft to understand. But he recognized the tone. Fear, fading into trust. She wasn't afraid of him now. She was simply tired. Jonah reached out and adjusted the blanket one last time, pulling it snug around her shoulders. The fire crackled. The wind outside howled like a wounded beast. Inside, warmth slowly fought its way back into her limbs. Jonah sat silently, keeping watch, refusing to sleep. Hours later, near dawn, he saw her inhale a deep breath, stronger than any before. Her color returned, faint but visible. The cold no longer owned her. For the first time, Jonah believed she might truly live through the night. He leaned close, voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking to the fire itself. "Don't die on me," he said again, softer this time. "Not after you come this far." And as the first pale light of morning touched the cabin window, the Apache woman, still weak, still trembling but alive, finally let out a sigh that sounded almost like peace. The fire crackled softly, sending warm light across the cabin walls as dawn crept into the sky. Jonah slept half, upright in his chair, boots undone, his hat over his eyes, and his rifle leaning within arm's reach. Exhaustion had finally dragged him under after hours of watching over her fragile breaths. A quiet gasp cut through the stillness. Jonah jolted awake, heart thudding. The Apache woman's eyes were open now, dark, alert, filled with confusion and a spark of survival he hadn't seen before. She tried to push herself up, but pain shot through her limbs, making her tremble violently with lingering frostbite. "You're safe," Jonah said gently, palms raised, slow and open, the way he'd soothe a nervous stallion. His voice held no threat, only the tired sincerity of a man who... He spent the night fighting death on someone else's behalf. She stared at his hands, then his face, trying to understand. Her gaze drifted to the quilt wrapped around her shoulders. It was old, but clean, patched over the years by Jonah's own needlework. She tightened it instinctively, drawing warmth into her bones. Her lips parted, voice faint, barely stronger than a breath. "Why? Help me," she whispered. Jonah pulled his hat off and set it aside. "Ain't right to let a soul freeze," he said. "Not out here, not anywhere." His tone was simple, but the truth in it carried weight. He didn't know her story, didn't need to. Cold didn't care who you were, neither did Mercy. For a moment, she studied him with careful, lingering eyes, as if trying to judge whether his kindness was real or a trap. The firelight reflected in her pupils, brightening the fear she tried to hide. Expression suddenly shifted, tightening with a sharp, her voice suddenly steadier with fear. "They will come." Jonah sat back slowly, not startled but thoughtful. "Well, they're welcome to it," he said. "Ain't hiding nothing, and I ain't done you harm." But she shook her head, panic rising. "You don't understand," she whispered. "They protect their own, fiercely." Jonah rose from his chair and stoked the fire, letting sparks climb into the flue. His movements were calm, but inside he felt unease coiled tight in his gut. He'd heard stories, warriors who didn't ask questions before unleashing justice, but he also knew she wouldn't have survived without him. She watched him carefully as he filled a bowl with warm broth. He helped her drink, steadying the bowl to her lips. She took slow sips, each one giving her a little more color. "What's your name?" Jonah asked quietly. She hesitated, then answered, barely above a whisper. "Nayeli." He repeated it softly, respectfully. "Nayeli, I'm Jonah." The name seemed to settle something in her, though the fear didn't leave her eyes entirely. When she finished the broth, she sank back against the bed, exhaustion pulling at her. Jonah sat again, watching her closely. "You ain't gonna be alone when your people come," he murmured. Hours passed as light slowly filled the cabin. The storm had eased, leaving the land blanketed in thick white silence. Jonah stepped outside briefly to chop wood, each swing echoing across the cold valley. As he worked, a strange stillness settled in his chest, a calm before something inevitable. When he returned, Nayeli's eyes were open again. She looked stronger, though still fragile. "Where did you find me?" she asked. Jonah explained everything, the tracks, the stumble through snow, her near-lifeless body outside the barn. She listened quietly, and when he finished, she swallowed hard, fighting emotion. "My village, my family," she whispered. "They thought I died. I was lost in the storm. I tried to find shelter, but—" Her voice cracked. Jonah pulled his chair closer, listening without interruption. She trembled not from cold now, but from memory, fear, grief, isolation. He hated seeing it in her. "You're safe now," Jonah said again, firmer this time. "Storm's past. You'll get your strength back." She looked away, as if unsure whether to believe such hope. But the fear returned when she heard something far off, barely audible, carried by the cold air. A distant rumble. Faint at first, then stronger. Jonah stiffened. He knew that sound. Horses, many of them. Nayeli's eyes widened. "They found me," she whispered. "My people, and they will not come quietly." Jonah grabbed his rifle but didn't raise it. He wasn't preparing for a fight, just bracing for whatever storm was about to ride into his yard. He opened the door slowly and stepped outside. The morning sun glinted off fresh snow, and there, cresting the ridge like ghosts, rising from the earth, came riders, dozens at first, then more. Jonah exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered, "that's more than I bargained for." The horses descended into the clearing, surrounding the cabin in a tightening circle. Jonah kept his rifle pointed at the snow, barrel down. He wouldn't fight, not unless forced. He looked over his shoulder once. "Stay inside," he told Nayeli. She shook her head, but obeyed. The lead warrior dismounted, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in decorated hides. His expression was carved from stone, unreadable. Others followed, spreading out, their eyes never leaving Jonah. Jonah stood still, hands open at his sides. "She's alive," he said simply. "Inside. I brought her through the night." A whisper rippled through the warriors. The leader stepped closer. "You touched her?" he asked. The question wasn't about harm. It was about significance, in ways Jonah didn't fully understand. Jonah nodded slowly. The leader's eyes flicked toward the cabin door. "Bring her out," he commanded. Jonah turned, gave Nayeli a small nod. Nayeli stepped out, wrapped in Jonah's quilt, leaning weakly against the doorframe. Gasps broke from the warriors, shock, then relief, then something deeper. The leader strode forward and placed his palm over his heart. "Naeli," he said, "we believed your spirit gone." She shook her head. "He saved me." The leader's gaze shifted to Jonah, hard and evaluating. "You carried her, warmed her, guarded her through the night." Jonah shrugged slightly. "Seemed the right thing." Silence fell, and then, unexpectedly, the leader bowed his head. Not low, not submissive, but with solemn respect. Around them, hundreds of warriors followed, dipping their heads toward the cowboy who chose kindness over fear. Naeli stepped forward, gripping the quilt. "He did not question who I was," she said. "He only saw someone cold and saved me." The leader nodded once, deeply. "Then you have our thanks." His voice softened, but his eyes glimmered with meaning. "And our protection, should you ever need it." Jonah didn't know what to say. Gratitude from one warrior was rare, from an entire tribe. It was a lifetime honor. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "You're welcome to rest here a while," he said. "All of you. Storm left enough cold for everyone." A few warriors chuckled quietly. Naeli slowly approached Jonah. "I owe you my life," she whispered. "My people owe you their trust." Jonah shook his head gently. "You don't owe me a thing." But she looked up, eyes warm now, the fear finally melting. "Then accept my friendship," she said softly, "and the promise that you will never face the winter alone." Jonah felt something settle deep in his chest, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. Around them, the warriors dispersed into camp-like formation. A long, unbroken line of Apache warriors, painted for winter war, spears and rifles gleaming, moving with thunderous precision across the valley toward Jonah's tending cabin. To their horses, preparing food, offering peace instead of suspicion. A storm had nearly taken Naeli's life, but in its aftermath, something unexpected had grown. Not fear, not conflict, but connection. And as Jonah stood beside Naeli in the weak morning sun, he realized the cold night had brought not just danger, but a beginning. A fragile, unexpected bond, one built not from shared blood or land, but from a simple act of humanity that changed everything.